In this episode, we take a look at adding those few finishing touches on the scale car, along with the process that I use in creating custom decals for projects that I'm working on, and then hopefully putting those finishing touches on that scale car. And we cover all this on this episode of the GN in 1970.
70s.
Ah yes, the old scale car project continues. Here it's obviously stripped. I throw a primer on it. This is Tamiya white primer. It's a fine white. I put 2 thin coats on. Thin coats go a long way. Here I've got Pullman green. Same thing. I've got 3 coats here, but 3 thin coats is better than 1 heavy one. Now what we're going to do on the underside is make sure that I get the brake rigging painted up. So this area across the bottom is going to get painted into black. Now that we've got that painted up nice, I'm going to let it dry, and then I'm going to move on to actually painting the air hose. Just to put a little bit of black on the air hose itself. And since we're working with the air hose, I end up putting on the bottom coupling. I want to put a little bit of silver at the very bottom, right where the air hoses would connect with each other. I use liquid chrome. This is the silver I'm going to use. And if you've not used liquid chrome before, this is insane. This stuff is crazy. It's made by a company called Molito, and it works really well. I use it on car bumpers and all kinds of other applications. But as you see here, you can put it on the coupling itself, and obviously it's going to be chrome. And you get all excited because, oh, they shouldn't be chrome, they should be silver. Well, when you dull coat this, it's going to go to silver. So that's why I use the chrome, and I use this particular pen because I like the size of it, and it works well for this particular application. Now we're continuing forward with the detailing. I did put the rubber hose through the bottom here. That's the air hose. It's not necessary for any application of function, but they've got the details, so I might as well use it. One area I did want to address from the aesthetic standpoint with this is actually the wheels. If you look at the treads, the one on the right is the factory one, and the one on the left is actually an intermountain wheel that I'm going to throw on here. So I don't just throw any old wheel set into this particular car. I want to measure it out. I have the intermountain wheel here, and I end up getting a dimension. And what I'll do is take the caliper and I'll zero it out after I've gotten my dimension of the actual axle length to see what it is to the factory. So the factory here is just shy of 20 thou. So you're looking at something that is actually thinner than half the thickness of a handrail like on a locomotive. So we're pretty good here. Now what I've done is grab the actual bag of all parts that I had set aside from earlier, and I want to dump them out and start assembling the actual wheel assembly itself. There are multiple pieces that are involved. There's a little tiny spring and there's a couple other pieces, but you want to get those pieces laid together and then now set them down into the actual scale car and start dropping the screws in. All right, it's going to take a little time to get all the screws in, but once you have it done, you're going to have a scale car set to go, and we need to make decals. This one's already had decals done, but what I've done is set the ruler next to it to get a measurement of the actual scale car to match up with the prototype.
It's going to be legendary!
All right, what I'm going to show you here is we're going to vectorize and create decals for the scale car that we're working on, but I do want to touch on exactly what we're looking at here. On the desktop, I am looking at the Milwaukee Road logo. I did vectorize the Milwaukee Road logo for the Milwaukee Road Historical Association, who has all kinds of great reference content. It's definitely worth tapping into. Just like the Great Northern Railway, they have their historical society, and there's ample amount of information to be able to research and look through. The SP&S has theirs, as does the NP. There's one thing I really liked about the Northern Pacific was the modeling resources. You dive in here and you can get into a lot of different details, like in this case it's actually the color cards. These are actually called color drift cards. It is matching it right to the colors that the railroad used. So let's say you want to paint your basement into lowy green. Not a problem. You pull up the formulas here, it actually has the paint color formulas to create the exact color that the railroads would have used on their freight cars. Now that's pretty cool. Let's get back to the logo here. I was fortunate enough to be able to work from the actual blueprints and create as accurate of a Milwaukee Road logo as possible. Now, with that being said, the vectorization of a process is just creating the line drawing of the piece to be able to scale it from anything from a postage stamp to a billboard. So what we're looking at here is actually the blueprint itself that I vectorized. I turned it into a piece of artwork myself, so I figured why not make it my desktop. Now, we're going to look at the scale car for the Great Northern. A couple things that I do is I use Illustrator, and we're going to create the actual vector that's going to go on the scale car itself, but you need to scale it down to 1/87 scale. So what I do is I set a ruler right next to the car. Now this is the BN car that I already had done, and I scale it down to 1 inch. I've dropped a guide that lines me up right at 1 inch, and I actually use the 1 inch mark on the 0 line, and I use the 2 just to give you the most accurate scaling possible. Now, is it going to be dead nuts spot on perfect to the prototype? No. You're not going to ever get there unless you're actually using, again, the blueprints from the particular railroad that you're working on.
Cheating gets it faster.
All right, so now it's scaled to 1 inch. This is a 187 scale car on my screen that I'm going to be able to drop graphics on. Well, I know I want to match them up with the Great Northern, so what do? I end up bringing the Great Northern prototype photo over the top, and I'm going to scale it with a little bit of opacity over the top of the 187 scale version, and then start laying the graphics over that. Now I'm using as a guide is the end of the scale car here and the end of the scale car to here, just matching up the face of the scale car of the BN. So now I have a prototype photo that is scaled down to 187 scale, and I'm going to start laying graphics over the top of this. Now due to parallax,
Parallax.
it's a little bit of an angle, so the actual logo is not perfectly circle, it's actually a little oblong. I'm just going to take that into account when I start creating my graphics. I'm not going to skew and adjust something that I know is circular and make it oblong.
Audience, say it with me. Legendary.
The way I look for fonts is I can identify a lot of them as a graphic designer, but in this particular case, sometimes it's hard to find exactly what font is your railroad's. I look for characteristics. Some of the key characteristics in the Great Northern, it just happens to be, I look at these, if I look at the numbers, the way the 6 is turning up. I might look at the G. I know it doesn't have a tail there. I can see the E is a little bit short on that center stem. I look at the fonts I'm going to use as comparisons. The bottom one here is a News Gothic, and the top one, Avenir Next. Now, what we have here is when you highlight them, I can actually just click through my font files and see all the different versions of fonts I can compare them to. So that's one way to be able to identify them. If you don't know what they are, flip through the fonts that you have, try to find something that looks close, and then work from there.
It's going to be legendary.
What we're going to look at here is actually just overlaying these, and I've already determined that I'm going to probably use the Gothic font here on the bottom, this News Gothic, but I'm going to use the actual numbers off of the Avenir Next. This window that you're looking at right here, this is actually Photoshop. So I just end up taking these. I'm using this because I have the ability to just click through my fonts at a rapid pace. And I'm just going to pop into Illustrator and bring up the correct one.
Boring!
When I'm looking at a font and I'm actually determining its size, in a picture like this, I'm actually going to use the vertical height of the letter as my determining factor of how tall the font itself is. And I think this is going to be actually like 4.75.
I have to poop.
And I know that this font has a little bit of narrowing characteristics, so I'm going to adjust those here in a moment. But before we get to actually modifying the letters and laying them down, I won't walk through all those steps because that's about as exciting as watching your hair grow.
No time for that now. The computer's starting.
So what I'm going to do is actually drop the logo in at this point. I've taken the logo, I've already vectorized one. I used actually a station logo that the Great Northern had, and I modified it to a freight logo. So as I drop this one here, I'm going to scale it down. As I mentioned, the vectorizing of it, it's because I can make this thing as big as and as small as possible. If this was a JPEG and I tried to scale that thing up larger, it would just get all pixelated and fall apart. So what we're doing here is just dropping this logo over the top. I do use a little heavier font on the logo going around that's in the black area because when you do print decals, those areas tend to shrink a little bit. So the Great Northern itself is actually bolded just slightly. And what I'm doing is working on the height of the logo. I can see I got to go just a little bit bigger, and that's going to be close enough for what I'm working on. That's a 187 scale car, Great Northern decal. And I'm going to go through the entire car, get all the information plugged onto it. All right, one little detail I do want to draw in on is actually the color of these letters. I've gone to kind of an almond color. I end up looking at my Pantone sheet, and it says that I'm actually closer to $74.99. So that is the color I've selected. For anybody that even cares what a Pantone color is, it's just an accurate color reference from a graphic design standpoint that I'm able to tell an exact color, match it up with the car. I apply it to the decal, then it's the correct color when they get printed out. And speaking of getting them printed out, I have Bill Brillinger do the printing for me, and he does a fantastic job. He doesn't just do custom decals, he has other details, which we'll cover here in just a little bit. But I wanted to note that from a printing standpoint, when I do custom decals, this is the only place to go. I've gone to a number of different places, but Bill's customer service, in my opinion, is second to none.
It's gonna be legendary.
With all that, this number across the bottom, you can see I've actually used a grunge type, and that's just to give it that impression that it's a stencil, and it's got a little bit of texture to it. And I did make this one a little bit more wonky or crooked, because if you look at the prototype, these match up nicely. So I set these numbers on here. That 5 actually probably could be a little bit bigger, but I'm okay with where it's at. And then that 1, 0 is a little bit tipped, and that's what I'm going to represent. So my decal set now is all set, minus the letters down at the very end. I just got to get that information dialed in. Once I do that, I will have this ready to print. I'll duplicate it. I'll actually probably make an extra set just in case I mess up on any of the letters when applying them. And we've got ourselves our scale car. So this is how I do decals, and we'll look forward to seeing how they end up going onto the car once they're printed.
It's gonna be legendary.
What were scale test cars used for? Were they A, to test trains' pulling ability, B, measuring the weight of a train, C, to calibrate the scales that weigh cars, or D, to ensure that full-size cars were 1-to-1 scale? If you guess C, you're brilliant, a regular GN expert you are. Like many other railroads, the Great Northern operated scales at almost every classification yard. As I mentioned before, when I do custom decals, I go through Bill Brillinger and Precision Design Co. He does more than just decals. He has a lot of different detail parts, as you can see here, to be able to add to your railroad. He does detail structures if you're going to do a sign or anything of that nature. There are some loads. This is kind of a cool load I thought was worth checking out. It's just something unique, and it's cool that he provides a prototype photo to be able to identify what the load looks like. He does the yellow one as well. So having unique loads like this on a depressed flat on your railroad just sets yourself apart from everybody else, having something unique. Now with the actual decals themselves, one of the things I did want to address is just the attention to detail that Bill provided. He actually took the time to look through my entire decal sheet, and it was some of the smallest graphics that I actually had and how to improve upon the sharpness of them. I had the Milwaukee Road logo, and I wanted to make sure that it was tack sharp. He just said, here, do a couple of these things and you're going to end up with a better product. Now I ended up opening up the envelope when it arrived in the mail, looked over the decals that I was working on, especially these small ones. These are tiny. Now we're looking at the Scale Car decals, obviously right there in the center, and as we're about to apply these, he noted the top ones are almond colored, the bottom ones were white. He sent a second set just to say, try this out. I would think that it's going to look better on your car. Well, I've done the almond ones in the past, but he wasn't kidding. I'm going to cut these logos up. We're going to get this applied to the car and take a look at the final product. And I end up using a straight edge just to make sure that I get a nice clean straight cut. And I end up here with this piece that's ready to go on the car. I end up dropping it just into the water and then laying it onto the actual car itself and getting it all set up. All right, perfect. That is done. It's done if you're hammered. I do have to settle this out a little bit more. I use an X-Acto knife to just kind of straighten the actual decals themselves, and then I move on to Solvaset. Solvaset is a product that I use to be able to make sure I secure the decals to the actual car itself. I end up brushing it on much like paint, but I want to make sure that just after I finish doing the decals, I lay the Solvaset on because it's actually sliding under the decal and helping adhere it to the car. Now that the decal has actually been set to the car itself, I end up addressing the actual coupler height issue. As you can see here, this one's got a little bit of a sag. Now, what I end up using is shims to help bring the coupler height up. I find in the coupler boxes themselves, they get a little sloppy. So I use, obviously there's the flat spring, but I actually modify a flat spring so it's just the flat piece of copper. I have to take the coupler off here, pop it open, and I lay that flat piece of flat spring inside where the coupler is at. I've actually taken 2 pieces of flat coupler spring and laid it on there and then put the spring over the top. Check to make sure that your spring centers, put it back into the car itself, and now we'll take a little bit better look. That's much better, but I can see the trip pins actually touching a little. I do use the KD pliers, and this is to help crimp the actual hose. You got to be real delicate when you're actually doing this because you don't want to just squeeze the thing and crimp them up. I've seen a lot of guys that have crimped them up and they look ridiculous. It's very subtle. I'm barely applying pressure just to bring the hose up just ever so slightly. That bottom part of the actual guide is showing you where a magnet would be, and now I've got a good alignment and I think we're all set to go. All right, now that we're a little older than we were when we first started this video, I hope we're able to take a little something from this, from custom decals to custom painting, and taking something like this that's just a small little scale car. It'll be a cool little add to the actual railroad for operations, and I hope you consider adding one to your railroad. Thanks a lot for watching.
70s.
It was legend. Wait for Ted to leave because he's now the Blitz. Dairy! Legendary!
I'm not the Blitz.
We really enjoyed creating these episodes of the GN in 1970 as well as Sue the Milwaukee Road. The only way we know if you guys like these is hit that like button. You can hit it, click it, smash it, whatever it is that you're into. You can hit the subscribe button if you want to see on future episodes. Just make sure you ring that bell. And if you want to see more of the Great Northern, you can take a tour of the GN in 1970, which covers the HO scale Wilmer subdivision. You can also check out other episodes that I've done of Sue the Milwaukee Road that covers the 1985 merger of the Soo Line and Milwaukee Road in HO scale. Thanks a lot for watching.